morning. I am coming to you live today, and you might notice that the background is a little different today. That's because I'm coming to you from Hardy Hall, which is at Zion United Church in Tupperville, and Hardy Hall is named after a former minister here, the Reverend Hardy. So, it's really nice to have so many of you watching today. I know I'll get some comments on the side here that I will see as we go forward. Now, today we honor so many things. Some days there's, really nothing and you have to kind of make something up. Not really, but, if you're looking for a theme. Today we have Father's Day. We have the summer solstice. We have National Indigenous Peoples Day tomorrow, but we're honoring it today. And the United Nations is also recognizing World Refugees Day. So you'll see some of those themes come up during the prayers. The title of my sermon today is Mistaken Identity. So hopefully you'll enjoy that. Now I have to tell you a little funny story that I heard on the radio this week. Apparently in the movies, they usually use the number 555 to begin a telephone number. So it can be 555-1234 or something like that, because 555 isn't an actual telephone exchange, at least anywhere in the United States. But when they made the movie Bruce Almighty, they omitted to do that, so they put in an exchange and a number, and believe it or not, people started dialing this number because this was the number that was used by Morgan Freeman, who was playing God, when he was paging the character. So the character kept looking at this number and saying, well, I don't recognize that number. And when he finally called it back, it was God. Now, here's the funny thing. People noticed this, they wrote down the number, and apparently people all across the country started calling that number from whatever area code they were in, and they were trying to reach God. Now, this, of course, irritated a lot of people. Got this, hello, was God there? And finally, there was a pastor. So, having said that, please do not leave messages for me. Well, I can pass them on to God in prayer, but then so can you. Anyway, so I hope we're going to enjoy this time together, wherever you're joining me from, in front of your computer, or later on Facebook or on YouTube later. We are maybe not together in body, but we are together in spirit. And that's what matters. That's what really matters. Now, I'm going to begin with what we call acknowledging territory. This is something we do regularly in the United Church when we begin a meeting. So I'm going to give you an example of what that is for here in our location. So today is National Indigenous Peoples Day, and so we begin by acknowledging the territory. The land on which this building sits is land that has been walked on, hunted on, and lived on for thousands of years. It is the traditional land of the Walpole Island First Nation, the Lenape people of the Delaware Nation at Moraviantown, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. And it is with humility and respect that we give thanks that we are here, in the space where we are in touch with Creator, who made it and made us. May our worship honor the relationships that are celebrated and invited here, and may we always remember the story of this land, the people who live here, and the call to live with respect and thanksgiving. And I'm going to begin our time of worship by lighting our Christ candle. As we light this candle today, we remember we praise God with joy and thanksgiving and seek God's wisdom for right relationship. And for the opening prayer, I'm going to read a prayer that also honors the summer solstice. This is the day when we have the longest day and the shortest night, as the sun and the earth travel in their orbits to come together in this solstice. Creator God, divine designer of the solar and lunar lights, the day has arrived when the sun has reached its peak tenure. We rejoice under its lights, its persistence in brightening our world. Day has delayed its departure. For the long days and 9 p.m. sunsets, we give gratitude, God. Holy One who gifted us the summer solstice, create a desire in us to give this day all our time and pause in the abiding daylight. Delay our time in the shadows. The night will creep into the days, demanding its mornings and evenings for itself. We know that our uplifted moods of this solstice will be quite different as the winter one rolls around. So today we do what we can to grasp the fleeting daylight and delight under the sun, to celebrate your presence in our lives, no matter the season, and to love one another on these long summer days. Amen. And I'm going to be reading now from our lectionary for the day. And the first reading is from the first book of Samuel, chapter 18, selected verses. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. As a result, Saul set him over the army. And all the people, even the servants of Saul, approved. The next day, an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house, while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. David, because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And David marched out and came in, leading the army. David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for it was he who marched out and came in leading them. And the reading from the New Testament is from the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 1 to 13. As we work together with him, we urge you also not to accept the grace of God in vain. For he says, at an acceptable time I have listened to you, and on a day of salvation I have helped you. See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation. We are putting no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found with our ministry. But as servants of God, we have commended ourselves in every way, through great endurance, in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God, with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and the left, in honor and dishonor, in ill repute and good repute. We are treated as impostors and yet and yet possessing everything. We have spoken frankly to you, Corinthians, but our heart is wide open. There is no restriction in our affections, but only in yours. In return, I speak as to children. Open wide your hearts also. The reading from the Gospel is Gospel according to Mark, chapter 4, verses 25 to 41. This is the story of Jesus stilling the storm. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" My tablet didn't charge, so I'm doing my sermon old school today using paper. So if you hear some rustling, that's all that it is. Have you ever been mistaken for someone else? It's been said that each one of us has a double somewhere. In German, it's called a doppelganger. I once met a woman who had been mistaken for me, and vice versa. Now, she was a member of the not-so-Amazon Baseball League long after I had left it, and I went in pursuit of other interests, which were the choir at MCCT. So finally I ran into her at a concert, and then it made sense because she said to me, "Are you that Wanda?" I said, "Yes," and she said, "Well, I've been getting people asking me, are you going to choir this Sunday? Gee, what a great service that was." And I said, "Well, I've been getting people saying to me, what a great game that was. Are you coming to practice?" Is he a slayer of giants? Or is he all four things? Who is he? In the letters of Paul, when he is writing to the church in Corinth a second time, he is writing passionately in defense of himself as an apostle. They have not accepted his identity and his authority in that role. And then, so they're asking, and you can hear it implied in the questions he asks them. They're saying, "Who is this stranger from Jerusalem? Why is he coming here to Corinth? Why is he writing to us? Is he a fake, or is he the real thing? Who is Paul?" In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' followers call him teacher. But yet after the storm, after they have been terrified, when they have seen Jesus still the storm, they ask among themselves, "Who is this that can still the waves and the wind? Who is Jesus?" Now, the question of David's identity will remain a secret until after Saul's death. He is the anointed of God. Samuel, the judge Samuel, anointed David as the future king. But that can't be revealed until Saul has died. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' identity as the Messiah is also kept a secret until the resurrection, when people realize that, yes, he was the Son of God. Now, people have asked a lot of questions about David's relationship with Jonathan. And these scriptures that I read at the beginning about his relationship with Jonathan are sometimes cut out of the lectionary readings, and I put them back in because I think it's important, even though they might have been removed because of being controversial. And people have said that, this is a claim about David's sexual orientation, that he is at the least bisexual. And others say that it is simply a covenant between two men, no different than other covenants that have been made. Well, I'm not going to come down on one side or the other, because I think the real question is, does it matter? Does it matter at all? Clearly, they loved one another, and whether that love was expressed in physical intimacy doesn't really make any difference, does it? The covenant they made with each other is an alliance or a pledge, but it can also be used of marriage. What is important when Jonathan gives David his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt? He is confirming David as the successor to Saul. He is giving up his claim as the heir apparent. He is no longer in the line of succession. However, he does not marry a model and move to California. The story of David and Jonathan is a bridge to the story of David. He is able to do what Saul has done. I mean, all of the people love him. Reconciliation between one another, and they need reconciliation between themselves and Saul. Saul is arguing with them that they have received reconciliation from God. Therefore, they must be reconciled to one another. Reconciliation is an important theme. It's important in the work of the church, even the church today. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in which the United Church took part, had 94 calls to action, and we're just seeing them being put into effect now. Perhaps that because of things like the discovery of the 214 graves of the indigenous children, we're looking at following more closely the recommendations that called for an investigation into what happened to these missing children and whether they died and whether there were records of their death. We need to be reconciled to people that we have wronged. But you know what Paul says is that the work of God is not finished and that they still have received the grace. But if they do not work towards reconciliation, then that grace is in vain. That grace is evident from the fruits of the Spirit, which he lists as purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, and genuine love. Now, I think it's important also to realize that when Paul names his afflictions, he is not saying that there's any value in suffering. Suffering does not have any inherent value. For the working of the kingdom. Now, in Mark's story of Jesus calming the storm, the disciples are literally in the dark about who Jesus is. The storm is a representation of chaos. the chaos which existed before. Some of the people who listened to this story from Mark might have been the pagans around him, and they would have immediately recognized that in this story, Jesus is being given the powers that they ascribe to Zeus and to Poseidon. So surely they would be asking the question as well, who is this that calms the wind and the seas? Now, his disciples have always been portrayed as being a little bit dense, and so they take a little bit longer to come to the realization of who Jesus really is. But Mark's listeners would also have heard the symbolism of Jesus crossing the water, just as the people of Israel crossed the sea, just as Jonah was carried about in the sea, just as also Noah crossed the sea in an ark. But this is the first nature miracle that we hear in Mark, and it's the first one involved. Kind of ministry that Jesus is going to do. It is an extension of the ministry that he is already doing. It's not a different ministry. It's the same ministry to a different people. Now, the interesting thing, too, is that Jesus and his disciples are not alone. There are other boats. And I don't know about you, but I kind of wonder who were in those boats. Were those boats also swamped? Did those boats come to rescue the disciples that were in this boat being swamped? And, sometimes we say, about the pandemic, we're all in the same boat. And that isn't necessarily true. I've heard from people who are either Black, Indigenous, people of color, people experiencing poverty, and others that experience the pandemic differently. We are all in the same storm, but we are not necessarily all in the same boat. I think it's a bit peculiar that these fishermen would not have been able to read the signs in the sky of a storm approaching. And why are they in such a state of were awestruck or marveled? But the real interpretation is they were terrified, because the Greek word is phobios, from which we get the word phobia. And it means scared upon scared, so really terrified. And yet they're terrified after they see what Jesus has done. They're not terrified before. In fact, all they're doing is really just what they do often, complaining. Why don't you care? Why don't you care about our lives? And of course, Jesus knows that he is going to give his life as a sign of what we need to do as disciples. Not necessarily to die, but to give our lives over to following Jesus. Now, I'm wondering why we're in such fear. Have any of us ever been afraid of someone in that kind of way? Well, most of us have been privileged to lead fairly peaceful lives. We're not under the power of dictators and that kind of thing. But I think if we go back to our childhoods, we might find that we were afraid of a single person. I think that a lot of us were afraid of Santa Claus. And, it's bad enough that he knows everything that you do. But then he sneaks into your house at night. It's a home invasion. Well, and then you get dragged to the mall and you wait in this long lineup. And then someone in an elf costume picks you up and plunks you in the lap of this man you've never seen before. And they expect then to have this Kodak moment of you smiling on Santa's lap. Well, I think half of the children end up screaming or crying. Now, I've looked back at my own pictures taken of me. The story, and there is a scene where Ralphie gets dragged up to see Santa Claus in the same way, and Ralphie wants a BB gun for Christmas more than anything in his life. And he's on Santa's lap, and Santa says, "Well, what do you want?" He can't speak. He's so terrified. And they put him on a slide to go down, and he suddenly starts climbing up the slide, and he goes, "A BB gun." So yeah, I think that's how we can experience being terrified and at the same time wanting something from someone. So I think, maybe the disciples at this point, they're kind of thinking that Jesus might be some kind of a Santa Claus. Someone that you might be awestruck by, but also someone that you want something from. I think it's probably the same kind of fear that David and Jonathan had for Saul. Now, if you ever want to read about a dysfunctional family, read about Saul. He threw his spear at David and at Jonathan, his son, several times. Now, I think if there's ever been a symbol of impotent rage, that's one. You don't have to go very far with the symbolism of the spear, if you get what I mean. Now, when the waves began to crash over the boat, Jesus and the disciples are an apt metaphor for what we are experiencing in the pandemic. Don't we feel swamped sometimes? I think we could make this one that looks more like the reign of God. Now, I believe that God did something amazing in the resurrection of Jesus. It was a fundamental shift in our relationship with God. Death was defeated. And in that, death was defeated for us all in the resurrection of Jesus. It's as if God decided to change the law of gravity. I think it was that much of a shift. Now, when the Apostle Paul called Jesus the Christ, it meant literally that Christ was the anointed one. The word is Christos, which means oil, anointed, as Saul was anointed, as we are anointed, symbolically in our baptism, and I believe also through our faith as well, that comes down upon us waters, as the psalm says. And we become the anointed and adopted children of God. And that makes us siblings of Jesus Christ. We are never alone. We belong to a greater Now, we typically follow the message with a prayer of confession. And I have found a really wonderful prayer, and it's taken from the prayers from the UN. And insufficient pay, and we did not fight with you for equal rights. You were fearful of being tamed or deported without a just trial, and we did not provide you sanctuary. We seek forgiveness for the ways we have forsaken you, and offer our thanks for the communities, people, and organizations who have extended welcome, advocated for justice, and provided sanctuary to people seeking refuge, despite opposition. Teacher, your instructions are clear. We shall not oppress migrant people, nor deprive them of justice. We shall not practice extortion or commit robbery against them. We shall love strangers as ourselves, for we have all been strangers. We shall share our harvest, our homes, and our lives with others, thus extending the same hospitality that you have selflessly shared. We shall advocate for the human rights of all people. Give us the steadfast persistence needed to follow your commandments in these challenging times, remembering that the love and respect that we show to each other is the love that we show to you, our compassionate teacher. Amen. And in our prayer for assurance, we also remember the fathers and grandfathers who brought us up in a good way. We give our thanks, Creator God, for the fathers in our lives. For those who are fathers, we ask for wisdom and humility in the face of the task of parenting. Give them the strength to do well by their children and by you. And for those who didn't have fathers who deserved the name, we acknowledge kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And even though we are apart and we are not bringing our offering together, originating from traditional Anishinaabe teachings from the elders, the seven grandfather teachings have always been a part of the First Nations culture. Their roots date back to the beginning of time. The seven grandfathers' teachings are wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. And in the spirit of these teachings, we give our offering. We have been blessed. Let us give so that all of these blessings may be shared. The offering will now be received wherever and whenever it is given. And now let us leave this time leave our places wherever we are, in a chair, in front of our desk, on a comfy couch, in front of the television, wherever you may happen to be. As we go back into our lives, let us go from here, strengthened in our inner being by the Spirit of our living God. Through this power, may we bring the message of God's kingdom to all we meet. Thank you for joining me in this time. May you have a blessed week.